Greetings, sports fans. This is the first episode of Tim and Fran versus the Man. I'm Tim Bajorek.
I'm Francis Tariffs, and we're here to discuss politics, philosophy, anarchy, and so much more. Today's topic, we're going to be discussing the origins of our philosophy and why we went to great lengths to start the show.
Yeah, this show has really been years in the making. We've had around 6 or so or more years to forge our philosophies, and we're finally putting something out there so that hopefully people can learn from our experiences and hopefully learn from our insights on the world and politics.
And so, Tim, you mentioned insights. Really, I guess a good place to start is, when did you start? When did you realize that you had the philosophy you currently have? And I guess on that note, what's your sort of current philosophy? I guess if you want to start there.
Well, my current philosophy, I would put myself mainly in the camp of anarcho-capitalism, or I prefer the term voluntarism. That's probably the closest thing that encapsulates my world viewpoint. For those of you who don't really know what that is loosely a system based on private property rights, a stateless society, and the non-aggression principle, which essentially advocates a moral system in which people cannot initiate aggression or violence against other people or their property.
Yeah, I would say, a part of my growth as an anarchist and as a free thinker definitely brought me to the anarcho-capitalist side of things. I really started my, political journey more or less as sort of a classical leftist, healthcare for all, housing for all, topics such as that. And of course, the government would guarantee these things. And then I personally remember drifting more towards a conservative frame of mind, especially in the early 2010s, when the Tea Party movement was in full swing. I remember hearing about, things like socialism, collectivism, and really becoming interested in the, at that time it was a conservative Tea Party movement. And I want to say around 2013, I discovered Adam Kokesh and other anarchists. But before that, I read a whole lot of Ayn Rand. I distinctly remember in 8th grade actually reading Atlas Shrugged. It took me, a year or so to finish entirely, but I do remember really being inspired by the works of people like Ayn Rand at the start. How about you?
My philosophical journey, I guess, everyone starts forming opinions when they're kids. When I was a kid, I was, just your run-of-the-mill milquetoast Democrat. I fundamentally just mindlessly listened to my mom because, she was home more often, and she would talk about George W. Bush and weapons of mass destruction. And these sort of things stuck with me a lot. I saw the Republican Party as basically a bunch of warmongers who didn't care about the planet. But, after a while, being thrown in the concentration camp that is the public school system, I pretty soon realized that the left wing that supposedly was looking out for people's best interests I really became skeptical of that whole idea, because the left wing is always a strong advocate for public education, forced education. And I kind of was, I was, as Ayn Rand would say, checking my premises. And I noticed that public schools didn't really seem to be teaching anyone anything. Most people learned basically nothing, and even if they did learn something, they would forget everything over the summer. And it also always struck me as very odd that the government was allowed to just, force children basically against their will to go to this place. So I started definitely going down a much more anarchistic path, despising both parties. So I read Henry David Thoreau, and he was one of the first big influences on me in my philosophy. And that's actually when I met Francis, is relatively recently. I think right after I was getting into Henry David Thoreau's ideas, and Francis started showing me about libertarianism and sort of more of those types of ideas. And that's I started slowly making a transition towards those sorts of ideas, because it seemed a little bit more practical than destroying civilization and going back to the woods. I felt perhaps that might be difficult to convince people of.
Yeah, and I sort of had a slightly similar experience. I'd always kind of had a life that forced me to live outside of the cultural paradigm a lot. I didn't grow up with a whole lot of technology. Home life was a little rough, so I generally kept to myself as a person in general. But at the time that I met you, Tim, I was, I just finished really being influenced by Rand. And also I had this neighbor, he was a lawyer and a staunch libertarian, and he gave me the book Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And the book completely, I think, changed my life in an economic way. And so I remember I was talking to him about actually Glenn Beck one day, and he rolled his eyes at me, and I was like, what? What's the, why are you rolling your eyes at me? And essentially, I was assuming that he was sort of a leftist and thought Glenn Beck was crazy and this and that. And instead of, saying that, he said, well, people like Glenn Beck really think we can turn this country around. And I was a little astonished. And so he gave me the book Economics in One Lesson from that conversation. And essentially, for those of you who may not have read that book, written by Henry Hazlitt, one of the only libertarian economists to be nominated to receive a Nobel Peace Prize, I believe. Essentially, it's the treatise on Austrian economics, the values of a free market society based on voluntary exchange, free of state coercion, and Keynesian economics. And so basically for my neighbor, someone like Glenn Beck was almost like too Keynesian, which, at the time kind of blew my mind. I was just getting into this sort of stuff. So I want to really thank him for sort of opening my eyes. But other than that, I did a lot of independent reading. I read a lot of Human Action by Ludwig von Mises. It's a pretty dense book, but that was another book that my neighbor gave me. He had this bookmark in it from when he read it. It was like these candies, these BBs or something, like Reese's BBs. And actually, he pulled it out, and I distinctly remember it saying the package was 88 cents or something. And he's like, well, here's a quick lesson in inflation for you. So that was pretty funny. But yeah, it wasn't really only him that helped to shape my philosophy. Again, as I mentioned before, sort of my past and just always questioning things. Tim, did you, when Barack Obama was inaugurated, did you have to go to did you have to watch it live at your school? Do you remember that at all?
No, I don't. I can't remember. I don't think I watched the inauguration in my school. I actually kind of recall most of my teachers, I don't think, were actually allowed to talk too much about politics, but they kind of ignored that right after the election.
Yeah.
One of my sixth grade teachers just got a weird little Obama doll, which I thought was fine at the time because I was still kind of an indoctrinated little Democrat at the time, and I was like, oh, that's good for her. I guess the modern equivalent would be a slay queen, of course.
I distinctly remember in sixth grade, we were forced to go into the auditorium, and there was this gigantic screen, and we essentially had to watch the inauguration, and there was a lot of excitement in the room. This was the man that was going to end the recession. It was the first African American president. All of this, but at the time, I couldn't quite describe it, but I felt this deep skepticism, and this deep sort of concern that school was forcing me to, watch a political event. And I guess, now that I think about it, that was a pretty critical moment as well in my early philosophical development. But yeah, in summary, I pretty much ran the gauntlet. I went from, sort of boomeranged from a left-wing, nearly socialistic in some of my ideas, more by, or less by the classical definitions of socialism. I didn't quite realize what I was, talking about. I was very concerned about things like climate change and the environment, and, watch videos like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth and a lot of the other sort of left-wing environmental, propaganda that's in the main media and cultural paradigm. And like I said earlier, it sort of transitioned to a sort of classical conservative, fiscal conservative. Bought a lot of Glenn Beck books, which is, in hindsight, pretty dumb at this point.
That's pretty cringe.
Yeah, wicked cringe, dude.
Glenn Beck, sorry if you're watching this. I don't know why you would be, because this is our first thing. There's gonna be a net total of maybe 50 views on this if we're lucky. Mm-hmm. So, but if Glenn Beck ever comes back and watches this, we don't mean too much offense, just the right amount.
Yeah.
Just. Yeah.
And really, I guess from there I, learned about libertarianism, the idea that your life is your own, you should live free of coercion, and essentially you should be able to make your own decisions about, what you do with your body, your property. And so I guess being a high schooler, and looking at a lot of sort of deeply centralized collectivist policies, things like Common Core, creeping up.
I remember we actually, when we were in high school, we actually protested that. It was just you, me, and Matt Miller walking around town with anti-Common Core signs.
Dude, a fucking downpour, remember that?
yeah, I do remember that. I don't know. That was pretty funny. We should have definitely organized a larger protest than 3 people walking around town. But, it was basically the most we could do at the time, because at that time, most people were pretty complacent.
Yeah.
And, most people aren't really thinking about, philosophical and political concepts in high school. Most people are watching the ball game. Most people are going to prom or whatever. So, we couldn't really get a lot of people to actually fight back against Common Core, even though most kids thought it was, dumb.
Yeah.
It's too bad.
Yeah, and I guess, where I ended up was, anarchistic. At first, it was more of a right-wing anarchy, anarcho-capitalism, and now I find myself being more of like an anarcho-catalyst. So I don't really subscribe to like a particular strain of anarchy. Instead, I think that, a lot of anarchist groups can find a lot of common ground and work cooperatively against the state. I believe anarchy in itself as a system could allow for the choice of essentially what specific strain of anarchism, groups may want to follow and participate in. That's kind of where I'm at now. I still generally, very much value the free market. I think it's really the only economic system worth, defending and, arguably one of the most successful economic systems humanity's ever developed and devised.
Yeah, I like the idea of anarchist unity as well. I'm definitely much more of a voluntarist. I definitely prefer a free market model of association. I think that that's probably the best, like most efficient way to go, and I think that that would maximize freedom without collapsing. The only problem I have with a lot of the other anarchist strains is that they tend to, they tend to suckle at the teat of the state a little bit too much. I think that, anarcho-communists and all these kind of people, they like to make fun of libertarians and ANCAPs for supporting borders. But, I mean, if you look at what they do, they support, massive social spending. They support Social Security. They support the welfare state. And they'll even get mad if you try to cut something stupid like NPR, which is literally a government radio station. And the idea that that's not putting out some form of, pro-government, kind of like pro, like tax increase, like pro-spending kind of narrative. I think that that's a little bit of a goofy way to look at it. I definitely like actual ANCOMs who understand that we need to like shrink the state, but there are definitely a lot of ANCOMs who kind of have this strange idea that we need to keep certain aspects of the state, because if we just get rid of the quote-unquote good aspects of the state, not that those actually exist, but at least from their perspective, if we get rid of the quote-unquote good aspects of the state, it'll kind of just allow capitalism or corporations to run roughshod over them. I mean, I think that's kind of a lot of crap, but that's, I guess, their perspective. But I think they're kind of ignoring the fact that, like, if you only ever go after right-wing programs, like, the state's never going to be gotten rid of, because the leftist parts are actually even more heavily entrenched, I would say, a lot of the time. Like, they're more insidious in a way. Like, they're more deeply entrenched in the culture, more deeply they're harder to get rid of because they're easier to drum up support for.
Right. And why would you say generally these more left-wing parts of the state are easier to have the public defend tooth and nail, even supposed anarchists defend tooth and nail?
Why would I say that?
Yeah.
I would say that the main reasoning for that is that, you can definitely get people to defend Republicans and the right wing, but their brand of of authoritarianism is a lot more simplistic. I would say it's very much fear-based. It's, oh well, look, these guys who are in the Middle East, they're trying to attack us, they're trying to ruin our ways of life, stuff like that. Oh well, think of the children, like they're like the drug war, and like just this kind of like goofy like shit that's very easy to debunk.
Right.
Whereas the left-wing aspects of the state, I think, are much more insidious because, it very much like works on our need to be compassionate. Like, oh well, we need to donate to the poor. We need to, donate to the elderly. Oh well, if we don't steal people's money and give it to artists, like there won't be any artists, and that would be really sad. And these ideas are obviously, at least to me, they're obviously wrong. And also, I would argue that a lot of the time, the left wing aspects of state power actually, they undermine the causes that they're attempting to champion.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to entrench people in poverty. They tend to make art boring because now it's just a bunch of weird, like, left-wing postmodern artists kind of just getting government like handouts. Social Security is just a straight up Ponzi scheme. If no one noticed, that's becoming insolvent. I think it's kind of clear that we're right on that front, even though, leftists still won't admit that was a mistake.
Yeah, and I think the current statistic, it's 17-1 is the current ratio. So you have 17 people paying into Social Security, and essentially, if you did the math, only one person benefits from 17 people's efforts or Social Security. So clearly, it's on a trajectory to fail.
Actually, I think that the even bigger problem, I think, is actually that Social Security, the amount of people paying in is actually decreasing to the amount of people getting paid by it, I think. Or that's the trajectory.
Right.
Soon it's going to be 2 people paying in and 1 person taking out, but the problem is that's pretty untenable.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, I guess it's kind of, it partially explains why these communists in a way, or, sort of leftist anarchists are willing to be minarchistic in the sense of, preserving welfare and public education. So I think they genuinely believe that, it's the state's role to do these things, whereas an ANCAP or, someone like a voluntarist or, anarchistic leaning libertarian sees much more clearly, as is true with the economy, and so is true with societal organization, that order is organic, and that, the power of individual charity, the power of, private wealth and capital and that flow, I could guarantee it just as much, if not better, a functioning society that's just as good, if not better, than we have currently under the state-run model.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think a lot of anarcho-communists don't necessarily see it as the government's role to provide these sorts of services, but they believe that they need to set up their entire they feel the need to set up an anarchist commune, or they feel the need to work with the state to push their left-wing values, so to speak. So eventually maybe the state can be gotten rid of, but they feel the need to, I'm just going to use the word impose their viewpoints with it, so to almost like get people ready for those ideas. But I really think that that's a mistake, because the state is never going to relinquish power, which is something I think more anarcho-communists, I wish more would understand that. I think some of them kind of understand that, but I feel like sometimes they don't really think it through completely.
So we've talked about a lot of instances where the two sides disagree, but do you think there's any room for them to come together on, are there a few issues perhaps that they could come together on, the ANCAPs and ANCOMs? I guess besides like ending the state apparatus, are there other issues like socially, politically, and perhaps economically that the two sides can come together on?
Yeah, I believe so. I think that ANCOMs tend to have as fervent a desire to end the war on drugs as ANCAPs do. I think that they tend to be very genuinely anti-war. They tend to be genuinely against the CIA and FBI and these sorts of more right-wing, what they would consider right-wing alphabet soup organizations. So I think that there's definitely there's a lot that we can agree on,
right?
As well. I guess, yeah, my one concern about all that is that if you only ever go after right-wing programs, then you're gonna really make half of the country very angry. That's one thing that I would that's one admonition I would sort of give them, I suppose.
And so, for you as an anarchist, and I guess this question can be applied to me as well. What was college like? What was growing up, or not growing up, but I guess going through the 4 years of college like as an anarchist? Well, I guess what were some challenging times, and times you feel you really got the message of anarchy through to friends, or perhaps you're in a debate and you really saw a light bulb turn on in someone's eyes.
Yeah, there were a lot of debates at college, especially going to a very like left-wing type of school. I went to an art school. It's called SCAD, the Savannah College of Art and Design. And, most people didn't quite agree with everything that I was talking about. I tended to stress the fact that I was an anarchist over the fact that I was a libertarian, just because I knew that if I said I was a libertarian, it tended to shut down debate faster. But, I remember having to like combat like a bunch of people on the old smoking bridge. It was a hangout place during freshman year, and I was like debating a bunch of people at the same time on like gun rights. Like I was trying to explain to them that the data is extremely cherry picked, and that a gun should basically be unregulated. They did not agree, of course.
Yeah, I feel like it's quite a leap, actually. So not only getting someone to understand voluntarism, but to jump to, I guess, one of the end goals of like an anarcho-capitalist society, which would be unregulated, untraceable, firearms, for self-defense and community defense. So I guess that was probably a pretty hard sell. For me, I went to college in northern Vermont, so very much a liberal, but also sort of strangely like socially conservative stronghold in northern Vermont. And I generally found that there was just like a lot of your like sort of classical left-wing socialists. So for me, in terms of economic issues, that was really mainly my focus. And really one thing of note in northern Vermont, in a sense, they're kind of their own country. So they're very distant from the rest of the U.S. political process, and a lot of these smaller towns, decide almost through direct democracy issues like their budget or, some of their laws. And so there'd be a lot of like socialistic type rules. I'll give you a couple of examples. Like you couldn't build buildings higher than 2 stories. There was no like billboards allowed. It's just to not, at least according to some of these folks, disturb the natural beauty of the area. Just really kind of absurd, like really backwards thinking policies that, were good in intention on paper at least, but, it basically led to the area nearly collapsing. I noticed especially my first few years of college, there was, widespread opioid use. It was one of the poorest parts of the state, and it really was quite depressing sometimes because you just see a lot of closed businesses that had recently closed. And so Vermont, I think, is a sort of a petri dish, if you will, of like really far left-wing ideas and sort of really hardened like environmental leftism and the ideas put into action. And while I lived in Vermont, I evolved more towards, I don't want to say a primitivist because I'm not fully a primitivist, but I certainly appreciated the break I had from the mainstream culture. I certainly appreciated philosophers like Terence McKenna and folks like that who spoke out against sort of this hyper fast Western culture. That was really about the only way Vermont had changed me. I think in a lot of ways I helped to sway some people that I had known. So I knew this ANCOM guy, and he and I would smoke weed a lot. And by the end of, he graduated several years before me, but basically by the end of our time together, he pretty much saw the light of anarcho-capitalism. I was just talking to him about voluntary exchange and how you lose that in a collectivist society, and particularly how you lose the ability to decide, where your profits go, and not necessarily just like your monetary profits, but like, to me, or to him, I explained that profit can be so much more than just making money. It's more so what you do with the money. Money isn't necessarily an end; it's more of a means to an end. And I think that really helped him understand, I guess, more of the idea of profit motive and the power process and things like that. And actually, when I first met him, he was working on this film about an ANCOM versus an ANCAP, like fighting each other. They're like 2 superheroes. It was the ANCAPtain versus the Caped Comrade. And in the first video, of course, the ANCAPtain was like the evil dude, the robber baron type. But then he like remade it and had the ANCAPtain like defeating the Caped Comrade. It was really quite a strange time, but I guess college is pretty strange in that way. But yeah, that was honestly a lot of the time the people I met barely like were political, or even even at the level of wanting to discuss things like basic economics or basic politics. So I ended up just talking to you a lot, Tim, about various issues, particularly when Trump got elected. That was
hilarious.
Yeah, it was hilarious.
Oh my god.
And also, to an extent, troubling.
To an extent.
As much as I, loved to watch the left-wing establishment completely crumble for a few days, I became quite disturbed. It essentially several factors. So the first one, watching former intelligence officials move into the media and attempt to initiate a soft coup against Donald Trump, basically throughout his entire presidency since like day one. Mm-hmm. And the general support of like people that I had respected as anti-war leftists, for that type of thing. So these people, they maybe helped to orchestrate the atrocities in like Iraq and Afghanistan, are now, media talking heads and pundits, to see blind support for them, it's pretty incredible. Another thing too I noticed was the amount of social engineering on social media like Facebook, Twitter, your big tech giants. Just these notions that Donald Trump was a racist, a homophobe. I never quite bought into those things. Instead, I guess my main concern with Donald Trump was his protectionist policies and his sort of Hegelianism. And what I mean by that is essentially a light form of fascism, economically. So, putting America first, putting the American worker first. In a free market, borders don't really mean crap. They shouldn't mean crap, The economy should be organic, even on an international scale. And, I certainly understand some of the arguments that, globalism was detrimental to a lot of the ideas of America and, classical, I guess, like Jeffersonianism, and like the health of the American economy. But I also, the ANCAP in me sort of sees the economy as something that should be completely separate from, the state, whether it's, Obama's desire to create stimulus, like quote unquote economic stimulus, or, Trump's desire to have the economy conform to national demands. I think, both things were equally as frightening. And on the other hand, is Trump hilarious? Yeah, is he a complete troll and like almost satirist? And do I like to see leftists, who have been smug and have ignored the rural and urban middle class for decades? Do I like to see them panicking and freaking out? Absolutely, but
oh yeah, that's probably my favorite part of this presidency. To be honest.
But I'm also just seeing like these sort of, many times these things were promised by leftists as well. Like, we're going to return these American jobs, or, the economy is not doing well unless America's on top. And, as much as I want to see, the nation succeed economically, it shouldn't do so at the or at the expense of, economic liberty across the world. Mises once said, if goods can't cross borders, then guns will. And then he was referencing tariffs. And so, putting a tariff onto other nations, eventually has a boomerang effect. It begins to affect your own citizenry, because you're putting money that could have, otherwise helped various sectors of the economy. You're essentially using it to, put a giant middle finger up to the opposing nation. And in doing so, you're affecting productivity, and we have noted a decrease in productivity and a decrease in manufacturing. Perhaps not as directly as a result of some of the tariffs, but, I guess just in summary, more of his nationalism made me uncomfortable.
Yeah, I remember during when Trump was starting his trade war with China, I was actually reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and book 4 in Wealth of Nations is basically an entire 100-page just treatise on why tariffs are so fucking stupid. So it was really funny to be reading that at the same time he was starting the trade war.
What were some of Smith's central arguments against tariffs?
His basic point was that when you impose a tariff on a foreign nation, basically what you're doing is you're not allowing the most efficient way to create that product. So basically you have to re-engineer things in your own country to create that product, but the problem is that it's less efficient, and that takes away from other parts of the home economy, which would be more efficient and better used. You're basically reallocating resources forcibly in your home country to a less efficient use by not allowing by not just importing them from foreign nations. That was his central argument, and I think that makes a lot of sense.
On a similar note, too, Hazlitt in his book Economics in One Lesson, actually ended up being several lessons. He discussed basically anything the state can do to the economy is detrimental inherently. You simply cannot have a mixed economy in any way. And, where Obama, he presented more of a left-wing vision for a mixed economy, I think Trump is, envisioned and enacted upon more of a right-wing, classical, Republican view or type of mixed economy. It's still a mixed economy nonetheless, and I almost think it's similar to, the paradigm between Hitler and Stalin. Stalin focused more on the international worker, and Hitler, of course, focused on the plight of the German worker. Not saying, Orange Man Hitler or anything cringy like that. But, where the left could really perhaps, have a valid criticism of Trump, instead they're, cutting off their own foot and saying, oh, he racist, and it's like, I guess this really shows how much the left has devolved as a movement and how much of a freaking joke it is at this point.
Yeah, I remember the day after. I remember the night of the election. I was following a lot of quote unquote fake news. The alternative media. Everyone said that they were. How everyone says that they're fake and they're not really reliable. So I was listening to them, in spite of all that criticism that they had, because, obviously they're more accurate if you actually look at it. And this is actually a good example, because a lot of the people in the alternative media were actually calling a Trump win. They exposed the fact that a lot of the pollsters were calling up people who were predominantly younger, and they were essentially asking for the youngest person in the House who is of voting age. So a lot of these polls are being skewed by that sort of data, and they were almost, I think a lot of them were almost purposefully doing this so that Hillary would win, to basically make Trump supporters lose hope, so to speak. It didn't work though. That really backfired. It actually just galvanized. It actually galvanized the populists to come out in droves against her. But I just remember me basically understanding that Trump was most likely going to win. I actually got high, really high with some friends and watched the election unfold, and then I was cackling to myself because I knew people would be freaking out. As bad as that sounds to say, I kind of also knew that a lot of the stuff flung against Trump was propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that I particularly like the fellow. I don't really like his, as you were saying before, Francis, I don't really like his economic nationalism. I don't particularly like his stance on borders. I don't like him being such a loose cannon, you don't really know what he's going to do next. But at the same point, I just thought it was very ridiculous how concerned people were that this sleazy billionaire might get in the office because they thought he was the next Hitler, whereas there was provable evidence of Hillary's like deep-seated corruption and her amount of shady political ties and the amount of crimes that you could basically prove, and the amount of just evidence that you could read from the WikiLeaks and whatnot. Like, that seemed very clear to me that she was like at least as bad as this guy. So the idea that he was so much worse, I thought was a little laughable. But anyway, I remember as he was, when he won, like, so many people, especially going to like an art school, they were freaking out. They were,
oh my God, I can only imagine.
They posted about they posted about themselves crying and stuff.
I'm gonna be honest, my mom completely like skipped work that day. And I consider myself an asshole generally, and so I had a lot of friends who were part of the LGBT community, and I was like, well, can you write me letters from the camps that you go to? Which was really, in hindsight, it was really messed up, but it was just it was hilarious to see, and also quite terrifying, what the social engineering was doing to people. And then I guess on the flip side,
Dan, I think we're gonna get the platform for that.
Probably, I wouldn't really care. As one of the new Rick and Morty episodes said, I see what makes you cheer. I don't really, Anyway, on the flip side, though, we saw a response from a lot of libertarian channels, particularly people like Stefan Molyneux. We saw them go from these truly anarcho-capitalist, philosophers to these, I don't know really how else to say it, but like these Trump cucks, these Trump following, people who blindly follow Trump. I remember someone had posted or commented on one of Stefan's videos that was very pro-Trump, essentially critiquing him for becoming an economic nationalist, and Stefan's only reaction was, I am what is necessary. And, as an anarchist, I think it's really, really, really important to never compromise on liberty, to never sort of back down, no matter, how, quote, anti-establishment, a presidential candidate is, for example,
I think that I can sort of understand why a lot of these libertarians sort of jumped on this train in a sense, and became more populistic, but I think overall it's a mistake, because I think that Donald Trump and his brand of quote-unquote anti-establishment thinking, I think it really dilutes actual I think it actually dilutes principles, because Trump isn't a very like philosophical candidate. He's very like pragmatist, but the problem is that he's like pragmatist to the point where it's not. He's pragmatist to the point where he'll do anything that he thinks will work, but that almost comes out in the form of him just like trying a bunch of random nonsense that's not really effective. I know that I know he does like some things that are a net benefit for the country. Like he's a little bit better than his predecessors, I guess, like in terms of actually like helping out certain they're like tackling some certain like big issues, but I think that the damage of the dilution of libertarian values in sort of almost selling out to Trump's populism. The problem is that libertarian values would be so much superior to the reforms that Trump is making.
Right.
Like they would truly make our country and perhaps even the world, if the world would adopt them, great again. Or great for the first time. Really. I think you'd see an unprecedented advancement in human relations. And I think that kind of like diluting the central tenets of freedom, which could bring such like growth and happiness to humanity and peace. I think that that's a tactical error of of epic proportions.
Right, and I actually, to sort of piggyback on what you're saying, just today, as of a couple of hours ago, this is January 2nd, 2019, I've got a quote from the Pentagon here. 1 second. So essentially there was a lot of people on the right and a lot of libertarians who, they may not have liked Trump as a guy, like morally, but they were like, oh, he's an isolationist. He's an isolationist in terms of our foreign policy. However, this just happened. Let me find the quote here. At the direction of the president, the U.S. military has taken decisive defensive action to protect U.S. personnel abroad by killing Qasem Soleimani. I'm going to probably butcher that name. Essentially the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Quds Force, with the U.S. has designated a terrorist organization just earlier this past year in 2019. To me, Trump doing that has sort of given into the deep state agenda since really the 80s, which has been to attack Iran, to provoke a war with them, to get them on the petrodollar. And in my mind, this sort of speaks to the error that many libertarians had sort of fallen for. 2016 was just super, super strange in the way that it seemed as though everyone lost like IQ points. Like all the philosophers suddenly abandoned their always anarchist philosophy in favor of, I guess not ethno-nationalism, but just economic nationalism is better than continued neoliberalism. And I guess between the two, it's debatable which one is worse, but I really don't want either, and I want us to start the process of creating a free society. And now we're dealing with potentially a very severe regional conflict with Iran because Trump has played right in with the agenda of men like Henry Kissinger and Bolton. Bolton's no longer the national security advisor, but he might as well be, with outright assassination not approved by Congress of a foreign leader that was highly influential in a nation that's quite honestly despises us currently. And so for me, it's sort of this more gentle, I guess, humanistic libertarian anarchist. This is just really showing sort of the failure of the brutalist libertarians who wanted to get Trump in office because he was more of a troll, because he was a mover and a shaker. And whether I'm right or wrong, I guess is still up for debate, but as of today, I'm really not the largest fan of Donald Trump, really, in short.
Yeah. I think that's I think you brought up a lot of good points. I'm really worried at this point that we are going to go to war with Iran, which could be, that's such a bad idea. That could be really devastating. Hypothetically, it could cause World War III.
Yeah.
I'm not really interested in getting drafted and fighting the Ruskies. That's not that's not really my idea of fun.
Right.
And I think that, I guess the one thing is that Donald Trump can finally prove that he's not working as a Russian puppet.
Yeah, I guess it's the one good
Which
thing.
is, well, it's one good thing for him. I don't know if it's necessarily like that big of a deal. I think that anyone who still kind of believes that is a goofball. There really wasn't like that much evidence for it. You know, if you want to link me to an article in the comments below, though, to change my mind, feel free. But I still feel like you're wrong. You know, I haven't seen any compelling evidence for it. But yeah, unfortunately, it looks like that the price to pay to sort of finally derail that stupid conspiracy theory that Trump is a Russian agent, I think that it's obviously not worth it. If we go to war with them, that could hypothetically wipe out, you know, millions of lives. It's a really dangerous game we're playing right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I don't want to spend too much time just talking about this, but, you know, as someone who's just seen perpetual war for his entire lifetime, I mean, both of us have, it's deeply saddening to see, I guess, what many in the libertarian right saw as sort of a last hope to sort of reverse the tide of these regime change, occupation wars, that really helped to essentially only grow the size of the state, you know. And the amount the state grew under just a small war with Iraq, like a relatively small war with Iraq, I can't even imagine how big the state's going to get if we go to war with, you know, a substantial world player like Iran. I can't even, you know, I don't want to imagine it. But
yeah, I mean, especially if we end up going to war with Russia because of it, because almost all or a lot of the largest power grabs by the government have always come in times of war. During World War I, there were that was the Alien and Sedition Act, right?
Oh, that was immediately after the Constitution, right?
That there was a second round of it, I think.
Oh wow, they could at least come up with like a more creative name, I guess.
Yeah. It might have been the Espionage Act.
The Espionage Act, okay.
There we go.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. It led to the jailing of a lot of anarchists, right?
Yeah, it did. I mean, during both world wars, you see a lot more authoritarianism in the state growing. So if we went to World War III, there would be a level of state power that we have never, I think, seen in this country before. I think it's, you know, I don't really think people are going to like it. I think that people aren't prepared for how bad it's going to get. And to think that it's all based on this sort of goofy anti-Russia propaganda and the fact that it's, you know, it's based on these like stupid Middle Eastern wars that we really shouldn't have gone into in the first place. That's really unfortunate.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, you know, on that note, it's just sad to see, you know, it kind of sounds like a broken record here, but I bet there's a lot of, I mean, I certainly hope there's a lot of libertarians who are, you know, who may have voted for Trump, who may have really supported Trump, who are, you know, reflecting inwards right now. I'm actually going to check Stefan Molyneux's Twitter, because he seemed to be sort of a Trump cheerleader. I want to see what he's saying. So he did release a pretty compelling video basically begging the administration not to go to war with Iran. That was in wake of pretty large airstrikes that happened in December of 2019. And he actually hasn't tweeted in a few hours, but I wonder if that'll change soon. After this isn't just like you didn't just like attack a remote compound. You didn't just like kill like like some battalion out in like Iraq or something. You killed like the head of their military. You're like killing the Department of Defense head, or like the Secretary of State. Like that's, I don't know. It's going to be intense the next few days watching what unfolds. But it just seems like no matter really who's in office, like these warmongering, like I guess fucks just always get their way. And the people who have wanted to, go to war with Iran for decades, finally perhaps seem to be getting their way. And, ironically enough, it's under the watch of someone who's quote unquote supposed to be anti-establishment. And, again, as I said, it's just sad.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that I feel like if these people aren't careful, like they're just going to be hung in like a Marxist revolution. I really feel that way.
So you're not thinking this is like 4D chess to set the Middle East on fire?
Oh, of course it's it's probably 4D chess. I'm assuming that they're attempting to I'm assuming they're attempting to keep the economy going by like artificial job creation, and also by forcing people who are trying to get off the petrodollar to maintain that sort of American, backed world currency. But what I'm saying is that I think these people are really playing a dangerous game, because you have these kind of very radical factions growing, and they're extremely violent, and they keep on kowtowing to them, or not necessarily the military industrial complex, but a lot of the other players in this game keep on kowtowing to these radical groups like the communists and the fascists. And if they're not careful, if they keep on like doing stupid shit like this, like they are going to get just like hung, and there's nothing that can really save them.
Yeah, and I think it's very evident too that we're at a point in America where the paradigm has shifted to communism v. fascism once again. I think no question that we've shifted towards that point. And in terms of just protests in this country, you see a lot of the protest action accompanied by sticks and helmets and weapons. I just certainly feel like there's sort of a powder keg of ideas that we haven't really seen since like the 1930s and 20s, with the rise of both right and left-wing socialism.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason actually why we're speaking now. We're trying to get our philosophical ideas out there. We're trying to essentially participate in the free market of ideas, and hopefully we can get a message out there. Hopefully people can pick up what we're putting down, so to speak, before they really pick up an ideology that's much more toxic.
Mm-hmm. Do you see really any kind of hope, in terms of the direction we're going in? Not just in terms of foreign policy, but, at home, where do you see people de-radicalizing, or I guess re-radicalizing in the direction of liberty?
I think that the only real hope I'm seeing is coming out of I think New Hampshire is seems like that's sort of a hopeful spot. I think that people who are much more inclined towards freedom are sort of amassing their I like what's going on in New Hampshire.
Mm.
I also feel one positive thing is that a lot of people are starting to take far leftism less seriously. I think that that's positive.
Yeah.
Of course, I think that the unfortunate like flip side of that is that people are starting to take sort of like right-wing populism a little bit more seriously. And I know that no one really takes like the far right-wing elements of that seriously. Like, no, most people are like, okay, well, ethno-nationalism, that's a bit too far. And that's good, but my essential worry is that what you kind of notice throughout history is this pendulum swing back and forth between different authoritarian ideals, and it tends to be the left becomes pretty authoritarian, and then the right becomes pretty authoritarian, and they keep on, basically like battling over the power of the state in order to impose their ideas on the other people or on the rest of the country. The problem is, though, is with that swinging pendulum, it seems to go further and further. Like, the ideas keep on getting more and more radicalized as things go on. So how many more pendulum swings before communism and fascism like finally actually do take hold?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think really, you'd mentioned New Hampshire earlier, the Free State Project. That's seen continued success. Essentially, the idea being that you take a low population state like New Hampshire, or like a more of a rural state, even Vermont or something like that, and you just load it up with people who believe in liberty. They don't have to be like your classical right-wing libertarians necessarily, but people who genuinely believe, or generally believe rather, that state coercion, whether it comes from the left or the right, is not good. It seems to be a place where there's more intellectual honesty and consistency, which is a bit more of a contrast to when a lot of the libertarian elements are calling for Donald Trump's election, which is just refreshing. Living here for a little while, a little under a year now, you can definitely tell it's just a bit more of like a freer society in a way, as much as, what's the group? Westboro Baptists can protest, there can also be, communists, or, I guess the general ideas that no matter how much people may disagree with them, are allowed. And I really think the basis, if anarchists are listening to this, or if people who are interested in liberty are listening to this, really the basis of being like a truly great anarchist is being consistent. So allowing the people you're not comfortable with to have the rights, and to not, fucking throw them out of a helicopter, or send into a gulag, whatever side you may be on economically. The thing is, for liberty to thrive, it means that everyone has to be free to, voluntarily exchange their ideas in the marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of what we're trying to make. Fundamentally, I think that's what we're trying to make this show about. We're coming up on a little over an hour here, and I think that's probably a decent time to end our first episode. But Francis, do you have any more comments you want to add in?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, kind of in disbelief it's been over an hour. But I guess in general, as anarchists, I think we can find a lot more similarities and differences. Economically, I think there's much work to be done, but we need to, if we are to combat these old forces, these old evil forces of, both communism and fascism, we as anarchists need to stick together. We need to be consistent, and we need to be bold, not violent, but bold. We need to be activists in terms of sticking up to the state, as many of us have already been, whether it's protesting, things like Common Core or, I think it could be entirely possible if you're an anarchist these days. I think you can be intellectually consistent if you both, protest ICE and, the cultural Marxism. I think you as an anarchist could be, essentially that's under the same umbrella philosophy. And I really think we need to, as anarchists, escape the polarization that's affected the sort of mainstream politics.
I think that fundamentally we need a philosophical revolution away from these outdated notions that the state is here to save us, that the state is the people, all of these sorts of ideas that the state has the right to enact violence. I think that truly, in order to actually buck this essentially parasitic mafia that controls us, people really need to start understanding that they're not helpful, they're unnecessary, and until people understand that philosophically, it doesn't really matter how many times you change them out. They're going to do very similar things. So I think on that note, I think we're going to be signing off.
Yep.
And so remember, everybody, viva la revolution.
And if we aren't drafted into the next war for oil or or whatever, we will see you in the next episode.